When news broke that the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, was dissolving, the first reaction for most people was likely, who is the PKK? The PKK is a relic of the Soviet era, and its affiliate organizations were once an important pawn for the United States in the Middle East. The group's unceremonious end is not just an aftershock of America's global pullback, it signals that Turkey, through a series of victories, is transforming from the biggest pawn in the Middle East into a new player on the global chessboard. The origins of the PKK can be traced back to Soviet efforts to extend their influence into the Middle East. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed Republic of Turkey, in an effort to resist Islamic ideology, aggressively promoted nationalism to build a completely homogeneous nation-state. In this nation-building project, Turkish authorities asserted that there were only Turks within the country's borders, no other ethnic groups. To make this a reality, they implemented a policy of forced assimilation, requiring all citizens to use the Turkish language. While such a policy isn't inherently controversial, the Turkish government wanted the outcome without paying the price. In the mountainous region of southeastern Turkey lived an ancient ethnic group known as the Kurds. They were physically almost indistinguishable from ethnic Turks. The only differences were their impoverished mountain dwelling and their use of the Kurdish language. In the eyes of the Turkish state, there were no Kurds, only mountain Turks. The forced assimilation policy was soon extended to Kurdish areas. For the Kurds, who were already living a poor, nomadic existence in the rugged mountains, this policy increased the cost of living. However, the government in Ankara had no intention of funding programs to lift them out of poverty. Faced with this unequal ethnic policy, many Kurds were forced to realize that they were not the same people as the Turks, and that they needed their own independent state to resist assimilation. At the time, the Soviet Union was looking for an opening to extend its influence into the Middle East, and particularly into Turkey, a NATO country right on its doorstep. Sensing the Kurds' intentions, the Soviets quickly made contact with Kurdish activists. In 1978, with covert Soviet support, a student science education group named Abdullah Öcalan founded the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, and became its general secretary.
However, after the 1980 military coup in Turkey, the new government took an increasingly hard-line stance against these leftist groups. To survive, the PKK had to seek more aid from the Soviet Union and shifted its strategy toward armed struggle for an independent Kurdistan. With the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the PKK lost its patron and should have faded from history. What saved them was not the United States or Turkish sympathy, but the complex political landscape of the Middle East. While the Kurds are the largest minority within Turkey, they are spread across the border regions of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The push for independence existed in all four countries. Logically, these four nations should have united to suppress the Kurdish movement. However, due to historical and religious conflicts, they were deeply hostile to one another. Iraq loathed Iran after the Iraq-Iraq War. Post-revolution Iran loathed pro-American Turkey. Pro-Russian Syria loathed pro-American Turkey, and both Turkey and Syria loathed Iran over sectarian differences. Because these four countries despised each other, they simultaneously feared the Kurdish independence movement while also using it to antagonize their neighbors. For this reason, after the Soviets withdrew, Syria gave refuge to Öcalan, who even published several books about the PKK while there. But Turkey was not willing to let the leader of a separatist movement go free, and Syria, sensing Russia's growing weakness, no longer wanted to risk offending Turkey by harboring him. In October 1998, a cornered Öcalan had to leave Syria and begin a nomadic journey. He went first to Russia, then to Italy. After returning to Russia, he was invited to Greece. Although he was welcomed and protected in these places, Turkish diplomatic pressure always followed. Finally, on a transit flight from Greece to Africa, Öcalan was successfully abducted by Turkish intelligence agents and brought back to Turkey. With Öcalan's capture, the PKK story should have ended for a second time, but it wasn't that simple. The Turks subjected him to long-term imprisonment, designed to be a form of psychological torture. This led him to renounce armed struggle and call on the PKK fighters to pursue peaceful negotiations. The PKK knew this change of heart was forced by the Turks, but at that point, they had to consider their own exit strategy. However, the Turks, believing they could crush the PKK completely, refused to negotiate amnesty or grant pardons. Even as Öcalan softened his stance, Turkey repeatedly tried to sentence him to death and kept him imprisoned on İmralı Island, guarded by over 1,000 soldiers. Just as the PKK was at a dead end, an unexpected move by the United States gave them another lifeline. After the U.S. launched its War on Terror, it allied itself with Kurdish separatist forces in northern Iraq to stabilize the country. The more chaotic the Middle East became,
the more valuable the Kurds were as pawns. The Iraq War saved the PKK from total annihilation at that time. Then, the Syrian civil war, which began after the 2011 Arab Spring, gave the PKK a golden opportunity to grow. During the war, the extremist religious group ISIS rose rapidly along the Syria-Iraq-Turkey border. Because ISIS-controlled territory heavily overlapped with Kurdish-populated areas, ISIS became the mortal enemy of all Kurdish factions from the start. The most important of these Kurdish forces is the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, which is still active in Syria today. Although the SDF claims to have no connection to the PKK, a significant number of its members are refugees who fled to Syria when Turkey cracked down on the PKK in the late 1990s. Therefore, in the eyes of the PKK's opponents, the SDF is simply the PKK's Syrian extension. In order to fight ISIS, the U.S. quickly established a partnership with the SDF, providing enormous support. U.S. officials even publicly stated that the SDF was the only force on the ground helping in the fight against ISIS, openly backing them. This support ultimately allowed the SDF to become the most powerful faction in northern Syria after ISIS was defeated. It also gave the deeply interconnected PKK a series of victories in its struggle against Turkey. The SDF issue caused multiple conflicts between the U.S. and Turkey. During his first term, Trump even briefly sanctioned Turkish officials. But the reason Turkey watched as the Kurds grew stronger with U.S. support was not out of fear of American authority, it was because they had a bigger prize in their sights. Both the Iraq and Syrian wars were rooted in the collapse of the old Middle Eastern order of strongman rule. The establishment of semi-autonomous Kurdish organizations in Syria and Iraq was a direct result of this collapse. From a broader perspective, Turkey saw a major strategic opportunity. Instead of focusing solely on the Kurdish separatists on its border, it could seize the power vacuum left by the crumbling regional order. So, for a time, Turkey not only avoided annihilating the PKK, but also used the border insurgency as a tool, whipping up domestic nationalism to support its government's bigger moves abroad. When Russia's attention was consumed by the war in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, quickly defeated Armenia. And when Trump won a second term and promised to continue withdrawing U.S. troops, the pro-Russian Assad government in Syria swiftly collapsed, and a pro-Turkish government's flag was raised in Damascus. The PKK watched in despair. The more Turkey won abroad, the more they lost at home. Syria and Iraq were now within Turkey's sphere of influence. The Kurdish independence movement, which had once been able to play these countries against each other, was now completely surrounded. This February, after 26 years in prison, Öcalan called on the PKK to lay down its arms and dissolve. The PKK's current response is simply a strategic move to show weakness, a desperate attempt to avoid being wiped out completely by a triumphant Turkey.